maybe 7 by now. But as far as I know, it's just these 6. Oregon isn't one of them. I was lucky enough to grow up over here in New York, on Long Island, in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood anyway. So I learned about it in Hebrew school, I learned about it in Polish school. But in most areas of the country, it isn't taught. So the gentleman whose story I'm going to be talking about, as Mrs. Pitt said, Walter Wiener, he went once to what was Kinko's, now it's FedEx office, because somebody wanted a copy of how he looked after the war. You'll see a better picture of this later. And it looks like a prison uniform. It's got black and white stripes. It doesn't look real healthy. And he didn't know how to use the copier, so he asked the youngster who worked there and said, "Can you please tell me what the copy machine is?" And the youngster looked at him, looked at that picture and said, is this you? And he said, "Yes, this is me." And the fellow said, "You don't look like a criminal." He said, "I'm not a criminal, I'm a Holocaust survivor." And the young fellow said, "Holocaust? What is Holocaust?" Didn't even know about it. This was here in Oregon. So you are very, very lucky to be studying this. And since there's so few states where Holocaust education is mandatory, I set up meetings with Alter and Senator Wyden and Representative Bonamici, because we want to get it nationwide if we can. I also introduced them to, let's see, on the left, former Representative Tobias Reed, state representative, who's now state treasurer, and Senator Mark Hass, because maybe all we can do is Oregon, but we'd like to get it nationwide. Guess who else would like to be able to make sure it gets taught nationwide? You've heard the name Steven Spielberg, producer of many movies, including Schindler's List. So Jerusalem Post recently reported that he's going public, trying to get Holocaust education to be mandatory nationwide. So the question is, what is a Holocaust survivor? Some people, like my parents, they weren't captured. Fortunately, if they'd been captured, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But they had to flee. Just imagine you're here at school, you start going out to the buses after school, but instead of buses, there are tanks coming, and all you know how to do is run the other way, and you never see your home again. Would that affect your life? So maybe that would make you a survivor of the attack, if you want to call it. So, was that a Holocaust survivor? People who were just forced to flee, like my parents. So in other words, refugees. What about people who were just captured and placed into ghettos, confined areas where you couldn't leave, very little food, very little water, no medical care, no place to sleep, terrible conditions. And you were held there for some period of time until maybe the end of the war. There weren't mass murders, there wasn't forced labor, but you were confined into this terrible area, and you survived. Is that a Holocaust survivor? Certainly anyone who was captured and deported to any of the concentration camps or forced labor camps, we would all agree that those certainly would qualify as Holocaust survivors. There's no hard answer. People have different opinions. I know that Alter Wiener's opinion is if you weren't in a concentration camp in forced labor under the really terrible conditions that I'm going to tell you about, he said, maybe not. He considers he and folks like him to be Holocaust survivors. But it's not a hard definition, but this is his opinion, which I respect. So this is an aerial photo of one of the concentration camps where Alter had been incarcerated. And this was, a lot of them were like this. They were off away from the cities. Nobody could get in or out except the Germans let them or forced them. And it was an isolated area, so that most of the population wouldn't see this or hear the screams, or if it was an extermination camp, they wouldn't see the smoke. So that's just an example of one of the concentration camps. So a little bit about me, and then I'll launch into Alter's story. So I grew up on Long Island in Great Neck in a conservative Jewish home, or as we like to say, conservative. And my parents kept a kosher home, if you know what that means. I had a bar mitzvah at the age of 13. I'm overeducated. Worked for many years as an engineer. So my family history, my parents came from Vienna. They're in northeastern Austria. And as I said, they narrowly escaped. My father, to the best of my knowledge, was already a physician, and he was at work at a hospital in Vienna when the Germans came to his apartment and knocked on the door and said, "We're looking for Dr. Mandel." The maid that they had at the house knew this could not be a good thing, so she wasn't going to tell them where he was. All she said was, "He's not home. He's not home from work yet. I don't know where he is." Because if they sent him then to the hospital, they would have rounded him up, and that would be the end. So once she convinced the Germans that he wasn't there and that she didn't know where he was, she found someone to go by bicycle to the hospital to try to get there before the Germans, just in case. That would be the next logical place for them to look. Found my father and said, "Guess what? They're coming for you. You need to leave by the back door and be gone. Good luck." And somehow he got out of the building, found his way to Italy, found his way to France, and ended up on this ship, the Ile-de-France, to Ellis Island in New York. I've heard all of this third hand because my parents never talked about it. Even though they weren't full-blown Holocaust refugees, meaning they hadn't been captured, they hadn't been in ghettos, they hadn't been in concentration camps. It was still so painful for them. I never heard a word, nothing. I knew they were from Vienna. I knew they had escaped from Hitler, but I never heard the word refugee. I don't know how anybody got from one place to another, who helped them, how did they pay for passage, how did they get papers? Nothing. This is one of the issues with histories that are so painful, people won't talk about it. So, talk to your parents, say, "Mom, Dad, what happened? Where were you? Where'd you grow up?" What, ask questions. I wasn't mature enough at the time to want to know more. Now I'd do anything to be able to ask them about it, but I can't. You'll see why. So my father came over in March of 1939. A few months later, my mother came over. What happened with Mom was that, her sister, so my father's oldest sister had already gotten out of the country over to England and was working in London, basically doing cheap labor, just as a housemaid. Brilliant woman who eventually got a PhD in chemistry, and there she was, cleaning sidewalks and stuff. Because the opportunities for people like that were very scarce. But anyway, so Erna, my father's sister, was already in England, and she heard through the news that England was going to be closing its borders and not letting in any more refugees. Sound familiar? So she somehow got, I think, a telegram to my mom. My dad was already gone, right? So she got a telegram to my mom and said, "Guess what? England is closing its border in like 2 days. So if you want to get out, now's the time." Somehow, my mother got on a train the next day, got herself to England, and that was about the last train that was allowed to leave Nazi-occupied Europe into England. So very, very thin threads. And again, I really wish they talked about it, or I wish I had been curious enough and mature enough to ask about it. My father came in March, my mother came in September of 1939. So once upon a time there were 6, mom, dad, 4 kids, and you can see who's the youngest and the cutest. As I said, I can't ask my parents anymore. My mom died in 1980 from cancer, and my mom died in 1983 of heart disease. So, and then I had one of my sisters died in 99 from multiple sclerosis, horrible disease. So all that's left is my brother, my oldest sister, and me. Fortunately, I'm still the youngest and the cutest. I don't know if you've been to the Holocaust Memorial yet up in Washington Park in Portland. If you do get a chance to go, I would highly suggest that you contact the Oregon Jewish Museum first. It's OJMCHE, Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Just remember, Oregon Jewish Museum. Contact them and go when there's a tour or when you can have a docent or a guide take you around and explain to you what all the symbols mean, because there's a lot going on there that you wouldn't know if you didn't have a guide. And even if you can't get out to Washington Park, if you're in Portland, go visit the Oregon Jewish Museum and just get a tour, get one of the, there's always docents there for the museum, and take a look around at all the artifacts and learn some more about this history. As Mrs. Pick mentioned, reading the intro, Alter is one of the few Holocaust survivors still living in the Portland area, and now there are even fewer. Last month we lost 2 more, unfortunately. Miriam Greenstein, who wrote a book, which name I forget. She just died 3-4 weeks ago, unfortunately. And just within the last 2 weeks, this gentleman, Manny Taibu, also an author, he passed away as well, so there are very, very few that are left. So yeah, every day is precious. So Joseph Stalin is quoted as saying, "The death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic." You know, how that relates to this, if you, I don't know how far you've gotten into the Holocaust yet, but somewhere near 6 million Jews were murdered. That's a huge number. How do you wrap your head around that? 6 million, what does that look like? It's a little bit hard to get a grasp on. So it's a statistic. There's the statistic. Okay, 6 million Jews died there. It's like Schindler's List are so impactful. It's about, well, who? Oskar Schindler. The Pianist, if you've seen that movie, it's about one person whose name I forget. What was the person's name in The Pianist? Other than The Pianist. Okay, watch The Pianist. Get it on Netflix. Very good movie. So anyway, so we're gonna hear from Mr. Wiener and let him introduce himself, and then we'll talk some more.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, willing to listen to my story. It's not a pleasant one, but it's a very true one. I might look to you to be a normal person, but I'm not. It reminds me the other day I spoke at a library in Vancouver, and a young man approached me and said to me, "I know what you mean when you say you are not normal. I am not normal either." And I looked at him and I wondered, why did he say that? Well, I came back from Iraq. I lost my right leg over there. But they fixed me with an artificial leg. People that don't know me personally, when I walk, they assume that I'm a normal person. But when I come home to take a shower or to go to bed, I realize that I'm not normal because I put my artificial leg apart. And I never will be. Same here. I have scars, physical scars, mental scars. They are constant reminders. I have nightmares to this very day, even though this happened so many years ago. So I'm not a normal person.
Are you sad yet? Yeah. Me too. So I do want you to know about his website, which I administer, alterwiener.com. It's odd spelling, so. But anyway, the video clips that I'm going to show you today, like that one, all come from a whole presentation of his that I produced when he spoke at Beaverton Library a few years ago. So if you go to his website, the first video is that entire presentation, and then the other videos are the references and so on. So take a look at alterwiener.com. Here's his book on Amazon, and it's a little hard to see from where you are, but as of this morning, he has 966 book reviews. I can't overemphasize how important reviews are on Amazon. This is how you, if you like the book, tell everyone else in the world that they should read it. You give it all the stars you want to give it, and you leave a comment, and these comments are pretty darn short, like excellent book and things like that. You might want to write a little bit more than that, but if you read the book and feel so inspired, we would very much appreciate considering posting a review on Amazon. So it was difficult for Alton to talk about. For many years, he didn't talk about the Holocaust. After he moved to New York, several years after the war, the only time he ever talked about the Holocaust was when he was in a meeting with other Holocaust survivors. So he was approached by Holocaust Research Center, which is now the Oregon Jewish Museum, and they asked him to share his story. And he said, well, I don't know. I have this accent, my English is not so good, I've never done it before, didn't feel comfortable speaking in front of a group, but he decided to give it a chance. His first presentation was at Century High School in Hillsborough, December of 2000. A week later, he got a surprise in the mail. He received a package with about 100 letters from the students he had spoken to. What did they say to him? Mr. Wiener, you changed my life. You saved my life. You made me appreciate my parents. You made me appreciate my school. Then he realized he's doing something important, so he agreed to speak again. And as of now, since he stopped speaking a year or two ago, he's given almost 1,000 presentations. I think it's 975 since December of 2000. So he's been a busy boy. And it's only because he's now 91 years old and just doesn't have the energy. So I'm out here speaking for him. So more than 900 now, it's closer to, as I said, 975. Once upon a time, 66,000 letters. It's quite a bit more than that by now. To people who have either heard him speak or have read his book all over the world. So he realizes how important it is, and that's why he kept speaking. As an example, on page 158 of the book, there's a copy of a letter with permission from the student and the student's parents. Someone who was an 8th grader at the time who wrote, the small print here says, I want to thank you for coming to talk at my school. You made me realize that I still had so much to live for and that life is precious. And then she writes, by telling us your story, you saved my life. I had planned on killing myself the next day. That's how important hearing stories like this is. On page 160 of the book, a middle school student had lost her mother to ovarian cancer recently, and she was very despondent, very depressed. After hearing Alter speak, your talk really showed me how fortunate I am. I still have a mommy, I still have her mother died, I'm sorry. I still have a daddy, I still have siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. And she said to Alter, you, Mr. Wiener, you lost everybody. Alter lost 123 members of his extended family in the Holocaust. She said, you, Mr. Wiener, lost everybody. I am grateful I still have a daddy and siblings and cousins and so on. So we saw her years later. She came to one of his presentations and surprised him after several years. She had graduated high school, graduated college, and she was working as a newspaper reporter. So why did Alter continue sharing his story? One was, as I said, the responses from the audiences, the letters, the lives he saved by speaking. Another is, as I told you earlier, there are people who are ignorant about the Holocaust. Ignorant doesn't mean stupid. Ignorant just means they grew up in a state where it isn't taught. So they're ignorant, they just don't know about the Holocaust, like that fella at Kinko's. Holocaust? What is Holocaust? The third reason is the craziest. There are people who deny it ever happened. How do you deny something that is so well documented, is the most deeply, widely documented part of any kind of war in history, mainly because of the advent of photography and recording at the time. So, even this guy, former president of Iran, I'm going to have Alta tell you about him in a minute, so I'll wait on that. But as we spoke earlier, Mrs. Pick, crazy things like denying a Holocaust are not just for people far away on the other side of the world where there's a war going on. This guy right here, Art Jones, is now the Republican nominee for Congress from his district in the state of Illinois. He is a Holocaust denier. He won the primary. He is now the Republican frontrunner for his district in this country, in the state of Illinois. If he wins the election in November, we will have a genuine Holocaust denier in Congress. I find that rather astounding and frightening. What does that mean? When you hit 18 and you can vote, V-O-T-E. Vote early, vote often, and vote well. Study the candidates, know what you're doing, and vote. If you go to this knucklehead's website, he includes a copy of a newsletter that he's promoting that talks about the Holocaust racket, because it's really just a money-making system for the Jews. This is one of the things the deniers use to deny the Holocaust. So look at all this money. People wrote books and they get paid to speak. Alter never took a dime for speaking. Remember, he's spoken almost 1,000 times. Never took a penny. If someone insisted on giving him an honorarium, he donated it to the museum. He never kept a penny or anything. And even the revenues from his book, when he gets a check from the publisher, he donates it to the museum or some other cost. So anyway, that's pretty crazy, huh? Berlin last month, my brother sent me this. There's a video of an anti-Semitic attack. What happened was that a couple of Muslims, one of them decided to do an experiment and wore a yarmulke, you know, the skull cap that Jews are, so not just Jews, but anyway, Jews sometimes wear a skull cap. And this fella, or these Muslims, saw a guy with a skull cap, assumed he was Jewish, and attacked him. He attacked a fellow Muslim, but he was wearing a skull cap. This is how insane prejudice is and stereotyping. Insane. Someone's wearing something and you attack them. I don't know. All right, so let's hear a little bit more from this handsome gentleman.
The third reason that I'm sharing my story, there are people who say, it's a myth, they didn't happen. They deny the Holocaust. Even the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, he said in the United Nations 2 years ago that the Holocaust is a myth. How dare he say so? That there are still Holocaust survivors carrying the mental and physical scars, and somebody tells you it did not happen? The book that I wrote, From a Name to a Number, why did I write it? I don't pretend to be a writer, an author, but I went to a church, a Presbyterian church, and at the end of my presentation, an older gentleman approached me with tears in his eyes, and that's what he told me. I was an officer in the American Army in 1945. I was one of the liberators of Buchenwald, a very infamous camp in Germany. And he broke down. He says to me, I have nightmares through this very day. Please promise me that you are going to put your story in print. Do it for my children and for my grandchildren. This is the only reason that I wrote that book. I have no financial interest in it. But the first copy of my book, I went to the post office and I sent it to the president of Iran. And I paid $30 to send it to him. And since then, every year, I'm sending him a letter with pictures, proving him that it's ridiculous to deny the Holocaust. There's no other event in history that has been so well documented as World War II, mainly because the advent of photography and recording. And still, prominent people like a leader of 70 million people tells his people that it is a myth. It's very painful, especially to a Holocaust survivor like me. Somebody tells me it didn't happen. So as I said, every year I'm sending him a letter, and last year I did something unique. I've been getting a check from Germany every month. So I made a copy of the check, and I attached it to the letter, and I asked him a simple question. If there was no Holocaust, why did the Germans send me a check and not to you?
That's a good question, huh? Why are the Germans sending out billions of dollars if there was no Holocaust? It's just crazy. All right, so remember I told you somebody wanted a picture of how Alter looked after the war. So that's that picture that he had taken just a few weeks after liberation, or a few days probably. At that time he was 18 and a half years old. That haircut is interesting. That wasn't his choice of style. Remember, he was in concentration camps. It turns out he was in 5 different camps. But can you imagine why the Germans would shave someone's head like that? Why would they give him that kind of a hairstyle to a prisoner? Any guesses? Yeah.
So they identified it as escape.
Perfect. Exactly right. Yep. If they saw it was impossible to escape, but if by some miracle somebody got out, got past the gate, or got over the wall, and was seen, boom, everyone outside would know. Oh, there's an escaped prisoner. Take care of him. So that's what that haircut is about. He was liberated in May of 1945. At that time, his total weight was 80 pounds. 18 and a half years old, 80 pounds. That's probably what I weighed at 8 years old. So I want you to do an experiment with me. Take one hand and grab the other wrist. You can touch your fingers probably, right? Imagine if you could do that with your thigh. Some people, I don't even know, I can almost get 2 hands around my thigh because I'm so strong. But that's how emaciated he was, that's how starved he was, that he could just grab his leg just the way he grabbed the wrist. The Russian doctor said, "I'm sorry, young man, you're not going to live long after liberation." And he's proven them wrong because he's now 91. Those doctors are all gone by now, but he's still here. This is interesting because it's the only picture he has from before the war. I think each of you may have something that looks a little like this. And you probably have, I don't know how many thousands of pictures by now. In your phone, on your computer, on Snapchat, and everywhere else. Guess what? These things didn't exist then. So photographs had to be taken, but yeah, I'm sure you have heard about it. Anyway, there were more pictures once upon a time, but they were all taken away. That last camp where they shaved his head like that, when he arrived there, they stripped him completely naked and took everything he had with him, from him. Absolutely everything. So the only reason he has this picture is that one of his former neighbors had gotten hold of the picture and smuggled it and hid it from the Germans until after the war, and then found him and gave him back that picture. This is clearly after the Germans had already invaded, because I know it's too hard to see, so I expanded it out. He's already wearing the Star of David on his arm, because the Jews had to wear a star to be identified. And you can see he's looking very despondent, sitting on the grass, wondering what's going to happen. This country has been invaded. So, where does he come from?
I come from a little town called Chrzanów, right here with the Star is, in Poland. Paul John II was my neighbor. We come from the same area. As a little kid, I had a pretty good life, according to the standard of living or lifestyle in those days. We didn't have any of the conveniences that you take for granted today. We didn't even have running water. Needless to say, we didn't have an air conditioner, a refrigerator, a car, a television. It didn't exist when I was a little kid. But there are certain values instilled in me as a child. The older I get, the more appreciative I am. Just to give you an idea, I had to go to see my grandparents every weekend, just to walk a mile and a half and to say hi. They never gave me a toy or a game. They couldn't afford it. It wasn't available. But this was my responsibility to show them my respect. We had a homeless person at our table, sometimes 2 or 3, every Saturday. And we are brought up to respect those homeless people. On New Year's Eve, I had to knock at the door of 24 tenants in our building to wish everybody a Happy New Year. This was my responsibility. That is the way I was brought up. I went to a public school in the morning and to a religious school in the afternoon, 6 days a week. So according to the lifestyle, I had a pretty good, normal life. And all this came to an end on September 3rd, 1939, when the German army invaded Poland. And as you can see, this is very close to the German border. So people try to run away, hoping that somehow the Germans will not succeed to occupy the entire country of Poland. It's a huge country, 37 million people.
So the Germans invade, and all they want to do is flee. And the question is, how do you flee? No one in that town had a car. Absolutely no one. I know it's hard to imagine. No one in this town of Charkov, which is hard to say, had a car. So the only choices you had were either walk with your belongings on your back, or if you could afford it, you would hire a coachman with, a horse-drawn carriage and let them take you out of town. So the trains didn't run reliably, so they got a horse-drawn wagon and tried to flee towards the interior. So here's Germany kind of over here, so they wanted to flee towards the east and ended up here at Dombrova, which is a few dozen kilometers to the east. And I think, if I remember correctly, that's where his stepmother had come from, so they had some family there. But who was it who fled? Not quite the whole family. First of all, it was Alter, his older brother, younger brother, and stepmother. But his father was ordered by the Polish retreating army to stay behind. They said, we need the supplies and groceries in your business, so you stay put, Mr. Wiener. Everybody else can leave. So they left his father behind, and then Alter, his 2 brothers, and his stepmother fled towards Dombrova. So they finally made it to Dombrova, which took a long time because the road was all clogged with refugees. What do you think they found when they got to Dombrova? Germans! The Germans were there already, so they actually accomplished nothing by their attempt to get away from the Germans. The Polish army was no match for the mighty, mighty German army, but they were stuck at Dombrova for about 3 months because there was just no way to get back home. Eventually, they did get back to their apartment that was completely looted, and they were unable to locate Alter's father, Mr. Wiener. And everywhere they looked and asked and said, where is Mr. Wiener? Nobody knew. Eventually, someone approached them from what's called a Judenrat, which is a Jewish committee, and they said, Mrs. Wiener, we know that your husband, Mr. Wiener, is missing. We don't know where he is, but we do know that at the outskirts of town, there's a pit of victims thrown in by the Germans. If you would like to know if your husband is one of those victims, you can come tomorrow. We're going to dig up that pit and see what we can find. So that's what they did. The following day, they went over there and started finding bodies. And then his stepmother recognized her husband, Alter's father, by some of the articles of clothing he was wearing. His face was already partially decomposed because he had been in there for about 3 months. So apparently what happened was that on September 11th, an infamous date, but it was September 11th, 1939, about 10 days after they invaded, they rounded up, I think it was 38 people, mostly Jews, some Christians, and just shot them. For no reason. They hadn't done anything wrong. They just don't like shooting a bunch of people. But they didn't shoot them to kill them instantly. They shot them so they would bleed and suffer and then expire slowly. This was the craziness of the Germans at that time. Apparently his father was one of those people who was murdered and thrown into the pit. So Alter, well, this is the turning point in Alter's life. He said, "Daddy, why did they kill you? What have you done? Who's going to take care of me?" In those days, the man was the breadwinner and the caretaker of the family, and mother kept the home. So who's going to take care of me? He was terrified. It's only after the war that the Polish government put up this monument. This is in the Hebrew language, as a monument to the victims of that shooting. Alter's father is number 23 on this list. And then sometime later, they finally issued a death certificate stating that his father had been murdered on September 11th, 1939. In Kacharnov. So, his part of Kacharnov became a ghetto that we talked a little bit about earlier. More restrictions every day. One of the first restrictions was that Alter couldn't go to school anymore. None of the Jews were allowed to go to school. His formal education ended at the age of 13. So let me tell you when Alter finally finished high school. What happened was, when he was living in New York, he used to clean toilets to make a living. But he wanted to improve himself. He wanted to become an accountant. He went to Brooklyn College and said, "I'd like to be admitted and learn accounting." And the college said, "Well, where's your certificate? Where's your diploma from high school?" And he said, "I don't have a certificate from high school. I didn't even finish elementary school." And they said, "I'm sorry, young man, if you don't have a certificate from high school, you cannot be admitted to college." So the only thing he could do was to work during the day, study on his own at night, and eventually take the test, which we would know as a GED, and get his high school equivalency diploma, which he finally did in 1961 when he was 35 years old. Finally. And then he was able to go to college and become an accountant. When Alter speaks, he used to speak, he'd say when he shared the story, he'd get letters or people would come talk to him and say, "Mr. Wiener, I'm so glad you shared that. I was thinking of dropping out of school. I was bored. I didn't like the teacher, whatever." And they said, "I sound familiar?" And they said, "I listen, I was in high school too. It's okay. I'm going to stay in school because I can graduate at the age of 18, plus or minus 1 or 2, and not have to wait like you did until I'm 35 years old before I can have a good chance for a better life." So, as I said, Kacharnov became a ghetto. Woo! He had to bow his head before any passing by German, couldn't walk in certain areas of the city. More restrictions every day, but at that time there were not yet mass deportations or mass murders other than the one I talked about. But then what happened is that in May 1941, the Germans knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and they took Alter's older brother away. And once someone was taken from their home, you don't know where they went, you don't know if they were dead or alive, you know nothing. Guess what? There was no Twitter in those days. There was no Instagram. Nothing. You did not, they were gone. You don't know if they were just taken out and murdered or if they were taken somewhere else to live. You didn't know. A little over a year later, June of 1942, the Germans knocked on the door in the middle of the night. They looked at Alter. did not ask his age. He happened to be 15 at the time. Normally they wouldn't take anyone under 16. But they looked at him and said, "You have a few minutes to get ready." His mother pleaded with the Germans. "He's such a young boy. He needs his mother. Don't take him away from me. Have mercy. I love that boy." What did the Germans do? They slapped her on her face, knocked her unconscious, and they took Alter away. "You dare to question our actions?" He never had a chance to say goodbye to his stepmother or to his younger brother. What did the Germans do with him?
What did the Germans do with me? They put me into a barn like that. Some of you probably saw movies, documentaries like Schindler's List or The Pianist. But picture yourself, 80 people pushed into that barn. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink for a day and a half. One of us did die. He died standing. There was no room to fall. There are no words in the dictionary to describe the conditions in that hellish camp. After a day and a half, I arrived to my first slave labor camp called Lechama in Germany. Upon arrival, I was leaving for no reason. But then something unexpected happened. One of the inmates or prisoners in that camp recognized me from my town, told me, "Do you know that your brother Samuel is in this camp?" No, I didn't know. So he took me to meet my brother. I did not recognize my own brother. Not seeing him for 1 year, he aged 10 years. It is one of those traumatic experiences in my life that I could not recognize my own brother.
So, why couldn't he recognize his own brother who had only been there for about a year? Just to give you an idea of the conditions in those camps. This is not where Alter was housed, but this is an example of one of the barracks somewhere in some camp. 24 people were housed in a room, 10 by 10. 10 by 10 is nothing. It's like a little square here. 24 people had to sleep in that. There were no mattresses, just straw infested with roaches and lice. This particular picture is interesting. I don't know if you can see the arrow, but this where it is. Right. This gentleman right here, believe it or not, just happens to be Elie Wiesel. This picture is online. It's a picture of him in the barracks at concentration camps. So anyway, let's look at these horrible living conditions. What about the food? Well, we'll get to that. First of all, here there's slave labor, just day after day after day, forced to work, given very little to eat. They were given 2 slices of bread in the morning. The bread was made out partly of sawdust. Humans can't digest sawdust, so it's just filler. They never got lunch, and in the evening, coming back from a long day at work, they got just some diluted soup. Lucky you were if you found a floating potato or pea or other vegetable. So people were constantly dying of starvation. According to Alter's reading, 50 million prisoners of war died. Very painful way to die because your body eats itself. I was a teenager too. I used to come home from school and go, "Mom, I'm starving. What is there to eat?" Please don't use the word starving. It has a very specific meaning and it's far, far worse than you have ever experienced. You can be as hungry as you want to talk about. Please reserve the word starvation for true starvation. In any case, his brother, remember someone introduced him to his brother and he didn't recognize him. His brother was pleased to see his brother again, but also very worried. How is my younger brother, Alter, going to survive the conditions in this camp that I have already survived for a year? Very, very worried. Well, on the very first day, marching to work, Alter noticed something interesting.
I had the impression that only because I happened to be a Jewish boy that I was oppressed. But then I saw marching to work so many different people. Each group had a different badge. Who were they? Jehovah's Witness, Gypsies, homosexuals, Ukrainians, maybe 30, 40 different groups. What did I learn? Every Jew was a victim, but not every victim was a Jew. Please remember that. Every Jew was a victim, but not every victim was a Jew. It is my personal conviction, not my belief, my conviction. If Hitler would have won the war, you wouldn't be sitting here in a free society. Hitler had a plan. Heute Deutschland wohnen über alle. Today we are in Germany. Tomorrow we shall be everywhere. You don't have blue eyes and blonde hair. You are not a pure-blooded German. You are inferior. I am going to enslave you. And if I feel like I'm going to annihilate you. It's very well documented. That is his plan. So we are all lucky that Hitler did not win the war.
Amen to that. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. So let's see. So Alter was at that first camp in Blechemer. I think that was that aerial photo I showed you earlier. I think that was Camp Blechemer. For 4 months, and then he was shipped off to another camp called Brande. All these camps were in Germany. And by being taken from Blechemer over to Brande, he was taken away from his older brother. He never saw his older brother again. How did he find out what happened to his older brother? Years later, remember I told you he lived in New York and would sometimes meet with other Holocaust survivors. One of the others said, Alter, I grew up in the same town as you. I used to work in your father's business, and I recognize you from when you were a little boy. And he said, I have to tell you something that I can't keep to myself anymore. I, with my own hands, pushed your brother Samuel into the gas chamber in Auschwitz. This was the German system. If you see, I can't remember which movie now, but several of the Holocaust movies will show you this. Son of Sam. Son of Sam shows this very well. They're called Sonderkommando. So they're Jews that were forced to be, like little Germans, forced to hurt other Jews or other prisoners. So the Germans just made this person who had pushed his brother into the gas chamber do the dirty work, and then the Germans waited until everybody was stuffed in there. The door was closed and locked, and they just sat back and turned on the Zyklon B poisonous gas and killed everybody. And then the other prisoners had to open it up and clear out the bodies and do all of that work. So Alter didn't blame this guy for doing it. He was forced to do it. But isn't that a terrible story? How we found out what happened to his brother? So, no date, no grave. He doesn't know when his brother perished. And of course, his brother went up in smoke in the chimney, so there's no grave. So in Camp Brande, very, very hard work, very harsh winter. The commander was a sadist, which is a term for someone who enjoys torturing others. Fortunately, he was only there for 2 months, and then he was shipped off to another place called Gross Masterwitz, forced labor camp, also in Germany. Again, very similar conditions, 2 slices of sawdust bread and so on. And the prisoner's job was to unload railroad cars and do some other things. At one point, Alter was working in a textile factory. They make clothing and carpets and things like that. In the same building as German workers. Just imagine this is a big warehouse and half of it is German workers on their machines making textiles. And then there's a separation, and then over here is we, the prisoners, are over here dismantling old machines so that the Germans could build new machines for the production of ammunition. So it's the same building, but they're separated. At the same time, there were signs all over the building that said, don't talk to the prisoners, don't give anything to the prisoners, don't make even eye contact with the prisoners. And if you do, you are doomed. One day,
day, while I was sitting and dismantling a machine, a German middle-aged woman on the way to the restroom did make eye contact with me, and she hinted to me with her finger like that. I had no idea what she meant. I had just a feeling it must be something important. But I had to watch myself that nobody should notice me approaching that indicated spot. Eventually I did find the right moment and what happened. I found underneath a box a sandwich of 2 slices of white bread with a slice of cheese. That German old woman repeated that act of leaving a sandwich for me every day, for 30 days, as long as I worked at that location. Now, I don't have the yardstick to measure to what extent it helped me to survive. This was only for 30 days out of 1,050 days that I was incarcerated. But the question is, why did she do it? What motivated her? She risked her life for me not once, 30 times. Every day when she put a sandwich, she risked her life. That's what all the time indicated. Why did she do it? She read on the radio or she read in the paper every day that I am an Untermensch, subhuman. And she is a master race. Why was she willing to risk her life 30 times for a young Jewish woman? What motivated her? What comes to your mind? I'll tell you what comes to my mind. Maybe she was down at my age and felt sorry for me. Maybe she was a religious person and she tried to abide by the tenets of her faith to help somebody in need. Maybe she wanted to make a point that not all the Germans were so cruel. I didn't know. I never will. But I'm so grateful to this German woman. She is my heroine to the best day of my life. Not just because of the practical help that she rendered me. She taught me a very important lesson. Now I'll tell you why. 3 weeks prior to that, a German guard, for no good reason, punched me and knocked out both of my teeth. I have no teeth. He was a German, and she was a German. They were both German national. But look at the difference. One was cruel, and the other one was humane. What did I know? That you are going to find good people and bad people in every group. That prejudice or stereotyping is absurd. You know Voltaire, the 18th century French philosopher, said, those who can make you believe absurdity can make you commit atrocities. So I am so grateful. This is the same message that I'm trying to convey to my audiences, life audiences of the people who read my book. Prejudice and stereotyping doesn't make sense. And I'm so grateful to that German woman for teaching me such an important lesson. I can just tell you that after the war, as soon as I regained some strength, I went to look for her. All I remembered is the location where we worked together, but I didn't know her name. I didn't know her address. So I went to City Hall, pleaded with them, helped me to locate a woman that in 1943 saved my life. Oh, risked her life for me. What was her name? What's her address? They look at me being insane. How can you locate anybody that you don't know her name or her address? But logic didn't play a role. I just followed the dictates of my conscience.
That one episode is so powerful. First of all, if you read the reviews, a lot of them mention this German woman. Also, there's a local Portland author who writes children's books. Her name is Trudy Ludwig. And after she heard Alter speak and read his book, she thought that one little story would make a great children's book. And this is a very highly rated book, and excellent, well illustrated, beautiful book called Gifts from the Enemy that talks about that episode with the German woman. Okay, we're gonna have to skip a bunch because we want to finish a quarter of and then have questions, is that right? Okay, so I'm gonna kind of fly through this. So, after Grossmoslowitz, he was sent to another camp in Germany, Klettendorf, his fourth camp. At one point, he found a raw potato in the dirt that he was digging and just ate the raw potato. Yeah, remember I talked about starvation. He said, if you are starving, you will eat anything you can get your hands on, even a raw potato right out of the dirt. So after 7 months there, he went to his final camp where they did that to his hair, called Waldenburg, a real concentration camp guarded by the SS, very, very strict, even worse than the ones that were just guarded by the German army, SS Secret Service. So that's where he was stripped naked, everything was taken away, that's why he doesn't have any pictures, he has no belongings, he doesn't have a birth certificate. So he was stripped naked and everything was taken from him, and he was given a jacket, trousers, a shirt, shoes, no socks, an overcoat, a cap, and a number, 64735. They never called him by his name again. Can you imagine to what extent you are dehumanized? I think in this pic we talked about dehumanization in this era. That you're just called by your number from now on. You're not called. You don't have a name, first name or last name. So very, very isolated. He says he didn't see a woman, a child, or a flower, or a meadow for 8 months. Didn't even see his own face. When he finally came across a mirror and looked at himself, he said, "Who is this person?" He was so emaciated. So finally, on May the 9th, 1945, the people in the camp assembled to go to work like they had to do every single day, and nobody came to take them to work. And figure what's going on. Eventually, at maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a Russian tank approached and busted through the gate and said, "You are liberated." This is the first they ever knew that anyone outside was trying to get to them and help them. They knew nothing about what was going on outside the camps. So finally they were freed, and after a few days, a German woman from the neighborhood approached him and gave him a place to eat, fed him, and took care of him for a little while until he had strength to try to go back and find his family. First he tried to go back to Grossmoslowitz to find the sandwich lady, and you heard him talk about that. And then eventually went back home to Charnov to see who survived. When he knocked on the door of his former apartment, they looked at him, slammed the door in his face, and wouldn't even let him in. He spent his first night back in Charnov sleeping on his father's grave. So this is how he looked right after the war, which you've already seen, and this is him a few months later. It just shows you what proper nutrition can do for you. He went from 80 pounds to 120 pounds and regained part of his health anyway. Well, he has a wicked sense of humor. If you hear him talk about it, he'd say, over here on the left, no girl paid attention to him, but over on the right, they changed their minds. So some pictures like this I'm sure you've seen. Here they are assembling, waiting to get on a train to be taken to possibly to their death or to the slave labor camp. Women, children, anybody, they didn't care. They just took them all. You recognize this picture with the shoes? I don't know if you've seen this yet. You know what that is? Shoes of whom?
Shoes.
Yeah, whose shoes? Okay, almost anyone. Anybody know? The children. These are specifically children's shoes. Yeah, very good. Yeah, you're very, very close. But with the adult shoes, they didn't particularly care about. For some reason, they kept the children's shoes so they could show off how many Jewish children they killed. I don't know. This is a famous picture. Tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of children's shoes. Just for every pair of shoes, there was a human being. That's gone up in smoke. Oh, I wish I had time to tell you about that. Basically, she's measuring this woman's eye color and facial features to decide if she's pure German or not. So they can decide what to do with her. If she's pure German, okay, we'll let her live. If she's not, well, decide somebody's worth or value or whether they deserve to live or die based on the color of their eyes or the shape of their face, prejudice, and stereotyping don't make any sense. So one of the arguments I want you to have in your hip pocket when someone tries to deny the Holocaust and tells you it didn't happen, you might learn about the Nuremberg trials. After the war, a bunch of German officials were finally captured and put on trial for war crimes. And their defense, you know, their lives are at stake. If they're convicted, they're going to be, right, executed for war crimes, which I think they should be. So, in their defense, how would you defend yourself if you were on trial? Most people would say, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. That's not what they said. They said, we had no choice. We had to follow orders. What does that say? That means Hitler gave orders and they followed them. How do you say there was no Holocaust when the people who were begging for their lives said, yes, we did those things. Just forgive us because we were ordered to do it. They're not denying that it happened. They're admitting that it happened. And yet there are people that say it never happened. That's insane. I'm sorry, I got to fly through this, but since you're all going to read the book or watch Alter's whole presentation, you'll get it. Thank you. German exchange student that stayed with my daughter for a while, and she assumed that Alter would hate her because her grandfather was a Nazi. He said, why should I hate you? What year were you born? She was born whenever you guys were born, 1980 something. She said, oh, that's 35, 40 years after the war ended. Why should I hate you? And this is Alter's philosophy. No reason to be ashamed of what parents or grandparents did. You are an individual and you need to be judged for your own merits, not because of what someone else did. Ignorance is the enemy of mankind. When Alter finally goes to heaven, this will be on his tombstone. This is his slogan. So, one more quick video. I'm sorry I'm a little late. So we'll just cut the questions short. I'm sorry, but I really want you to hear this part.
Something about hope, because a lot of young kids today, they find life meaningless, and if there's a problem, they kill themselves. There are many cases that I'm aware of. I have over 100 letters from young students that this was intended to do, to commit suicide, but they changed their minds after hearing it. But let me tell you something about what happened to me. In February 1945, I was so emaciated that I couldn't wear anymore. So the way the system works, if you cannot wear, they kill you. But there was no crematorium in that camp by the book that I wrote. So they sent me to another camp where there was a crematorium. And I was standing in line. I could smell the offensive odor of burning flesh. I saw the chimney, and I knew that my life is coming to an end. It was a terrible, terrible feeling. And while I was standing in line, a German entrepreneur approached me, and he shouted to me, "Come on, now, wenn du kannst aber die Arbeit kapieren, get out of that line, young boy. You can still work and expire at work." And he sent me back to work. A few weeks later, I was liberated. So you never know. You never know.
So, a little bit something about hope. So, given the time we have, I'll stop there, and maybe we have time for a fantastic audience. I could never have sat still how crazy that you guys did. So, thank you for your attention. What questions do you have, and then we'll wrap up. Raise a hand so I can see you. Yeah, hi.
Have you ever had a conversation with a Holocaust denier?
Have I ever had a conversation? Confrontation.
With a Holocaust denier. What did it look like?
Oh, wow. Have I ever had a confrontation or conversation with a Holocaust denier? I have not. I'm nervous about it, but sometimes you can't change people's minds. It's like, dude, you're insane, you know. But if you were going to argue with them, I want you to have this ammunition. just give them this book. Just take the book and say, here, read this. Yeah,
You kind of tapped on it a bit.
louder, please.
You kind of tapped on it a bit earlier about like, hey, that sounds familiar. But since this is just something who's gone through that, are you most like concerned with seeing patterns and stuff like that rising again, especially with Earth and climate in the U.S.?
Yeah, am I concerned about that happening again? I'm very concerned. And, things like that have happened again. I don't know if you learned about Kosovo and other places where oppression has happened. I'm very concerned. And that's why we need you all to be aware. We need you to vote. We need you to, run for office if you feel like it at some point. Yeah, we all need to work together to fight oppression. I'm very concerned. Oh, here we go. Hi. Lady first. What made me so passionate? Well, of course, I have a family history that's parallel to it. And just having heard him, you hear how he speaks. You hear him live, you'd be hooked too. It's a very powerful story that I think needs to be told over and over again. Actually, I have the movie rights. I actually arranged to get the movie rights from him. Someday there will be a movie about this, or documentary. And the reason I did that is I'm convinced if everyone in the world reads this book or hears this story, there would be peace on earth. I mean, this is so powerful. I don't know how you deny stuff like this and how you continue behaving that way, once you hear this. So that's why I'm so passionate about it. Yes, ma'am.
We may learn about this later, but how did it came to an end? How did the Holocaust stop?
How it came to an end is, I hope you do get to it. I don't know all the details, but I know that the Allies, which is Americans, British, and French, finally started to get the upper hand. The Russians, tens of millions of whom were murdered by the Germans, they finally started to get the upper hand, and it closed in finally on Germany. But it took years and years to get the upper hand. So, yeah. Thank you. Hi.
How did you learn about your parents' story?
How did I learn about it? That's a very good question. So I do have a cousin here in the States. Her mother was my father's other sister. And that mother, she used to talk about it all the time. She freely shared. She was very open with it. So I learned a lot from my cousins, so kind of secondhand like that. And then which ships they came on, Ancestry.com. All that's public data now. I knew someone who had a subscription. They said, hey, can you find my parents? Like, here's your dad on this ship, here's your mom on this ship. But I learned about everything just from my relatives and ancestors.
Do you have a guess or an estimation of how many people actually survived concentration camps? Went on with lives outside of that?
Yeah. How many survived concentration camps, Mrs. Pitt, do you know?
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. Zach, I can get back to you on that.
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, maybe let me know what you find out, would you? Yeah, thank you. Okay, one more. I think you guys got to run. The main difference would be, that's a very good question. They're both by sources. The difference between Alder's book and Night, which you've read. So different people's stories. It's been a while since I read Night. I don't know how to answer that. Just a different set of experiences and the thin thread where they got help along the way and how they managed to survive whatever they were tortured with at the time. I can't give you better answer than that. I'm sorry. That's a good question. Mrs. Pick, how are we doing?
I think we're doing great. Does anybody have any last question? So with that, I just really wanted to thank Mr. Mandel for speaking today.